Lecture 2, Discourse Analysis. Our first step in the study of discourse analysis has to be figuring out exactly what we mean by discourse and why it is so important to learn how to analyze it. To start out, we can say that discourse analysis is the study of language. Many people would define discourse analysis as a subfield of linguistics, which is the scientific study of language. Different kinds of linguists study different aspects of language. Phonologists study the sounds of language and how people use them. Lexicographers study words, their meanings and their histories. Grammarians study how words are put together to form sentences and spoken utterances. And discourse analysts study the way sentences and utterances go together to make texts and interactions and how those texts and interactions fit into our social world. But discourse analysis is not just the study of language, but a way of looking at language that focuses on how people use it in real life to do things like argue, persuade, and flirt, and how to show they are certain kinds of people or belong to certain groups. This way of looking at language is based on four main assumptions. They are: language is ambiguous. What things mean is never absolutely clear. All communication involves interpreting what other people mean and what they are trying to do. Language is always in the world. That is, what language means is always a matter of whether and when it is used and what it is used to do. The way we use language is inseparable from who we are and different social groups to which we belong. We use language to display different kinds of social identities and to show that we belong to different groups. Language is never used all by itself. It is always combined with other things, such as our tone of voice, facial expressions, gestures when we speak, and the fonts, layouts, graphics we use in written texts. What language means and what we can do with it, often a matter of how it is combined with these other things. The ambiguity of language. Everyone has had the experience of puzzling over what someone, a lover or a parent or a friend, meant by what he or she said. In fact, nearly all communication contains some elements of meaning that are not expressed directly by the words that are spoken or written. Even when we think we are expressing ourselves clearly and directly, we may not. For example, you may want to borrow a pen from someone and express this desire with the question, "Do you have a pen?" Strictly speaking, though this question does not directly communicate that you need a pen, it only asks if the other person is in possession of one. In order to understand this question as a request, the other person needs to undertake a process of figuring out what we mean. A process which in this case may be lightly unconscious and automatic, but which is all the same a process of interpretation. So we can take as a starting point to our study of discourse analysis the fact that people don't always say what they mean and people don't always mean what they say. This is not because people are trying to trick or deceive each other, though sometimes they are, but because language is, by its very nature, ambiguous. To say exactly what we mean all the time would be impossible. First, because, as poets, lovers, and every lawyer knows, language is an imperfect tool for the precise expression of many things we think and feel. And second, because whenever we communicate, we always mean to communicate more than just one thing. When you ask your friend if he or she has a pen, for example, you mean to communicate not just that you need a pen, but also that you do not wish to impose on them or that you feel a bit shy about borrowing a pen which is one of the reasons why you approach the whole business of requesting indirectly by asking if they have a pen, even when you know very well that they have a one. Language in the world. One of the most important ways to understand what people mean when they communicate is by making reference to the social context within which they are speaking or writing. The meaning of an utterance can change drastically depending on who is saying it, when and where it is said, and to whom it is said. If a teacher asks a student who is about to take an examination the same question we discussed above, "Do you have a pen?" it is rather unlikely that this is a request or that the teacher is a bit shy about communicating with the student. Rather, this utterance is probably designed to make sure that the student has the proper tool to take the examination, or to inform the student that a pen, not a pencil, must be used. In other words, when we speak of discourse, we are always speaking of language that is in some way was situated. Language is always situated in at least 4 different ways. First, language is situated within the material world and where we encounter it, whether it is on a shop sign or in a textbook or on a particular website, contribute to the way we interpret it. Second, language is situated within relationships. One of the main ways we understand what people mean when they speak or write is by referring to who they are, how well we know them, and whether or not they have some kind of power over us. Third, language is situated in history, that is, in relation to what happened before and what we expect to happen afterwards. Finally, language is situated in relation to other language. Utterances and texts always respond to or refer to other utterances and texts. That is, everything that we say or write is situated in a kind of network of discourse. Language and social identity. Not only is discourse situated partly by who says or writes what or who or to whom, but people, the whos and the whom's, who say or write these things are also situated by discourse. What is meant by this is that whenever people speak or write, they are, through their discourse, somehow demonstrating who they are and what their relationship is to other people. They're enacting their identities. The important thing about such identities is that they are multiple and fluid, rather than singular and fixed. The identity I enact at the dance club on Friday night is not the same identity I enact at the office on Monday morning. The reason for this is not that I change my personality in any fundamental way, but rather that I change the way I use language. Changing the way I use language when enact the identity of a dance club diva or a yoga teacher or a university professor, of course, is not enough to fully enact these identities. I also have to dress in certain ways, act in certain ways, and hang out in certain places with certain people. In other words, language alone cannot achieve all the things I need to do to be a certain kind of person. I always have to combine that language with other things like fashion, gestures, and handling of various kinds of objects. Partially because of its roots in linguistics, discourse analysts used to focus almost exclusively on written or spoken language. Now people are increasingly realizing not just that we communicate in a lot of ways that do not involve language, but that in order to understand what people mean when they use language, we need to pay attention to the way it is combined with these other communicative methods. Given these 4 principles, we can begin to understand some of the reasons why learning how to analyze discourse might be useful. The chief reason is that we already engage in discourse analysis in all the time when we try to figure out what people mean by what they say, and when we try to express our multiple and complicated meanings to them. We must bear in mind that none of us is immune to misunderstandings, to offending people by saying the wrong thing, to struggling to get our message across, or to being taken in by someone who is trying somehow to cheat us. Hopefully, by understanding how discourse works, we will be able to understand people better and communicate more effectively. Studying discourse analysis, however, can teach you more than that, since the way we use discourse is tied up with our social identities and our social relationships. Discourse analysis can help us to understand how the societies in which we live are put together and how they are maintained through our day-to-day activities of speaking, writing, and making sense of other modes of communication. It can help us to understand why people interact with one another the way they do, and how they exert power and influence over one another. It can help us to understand how people view reality differently and why they view it that way. The study of discourse analysis, then, is not just the study of how we use language. It is also indirectly the study of romance, friendship, psychology, politics, power, and a whole lot of other things. Discourse analysts analyze texts and conversations. But what is a text and what is a conversation? What distinguishes texts and conversations from random collection of sentences and utterances? Consider the following list of words: milk, spaghetti, tomatoes, rocket, light bulbs. You might look at this list and conclude that this is not a text for the simple reason that it makes no sense to you, that it has no meaning. According to the linguist Halliday, meaning is the most important thing that makes a text a text. It has to make sense. A text, in his view, is everything that is meaningful in a particular situation, and the basis for meaning is choice. Whenever I choose one thing rather than another from a set of alternatives, yes or no, up or down, red or blue, I am making meaning. This focus on meaning, in fact, is one of the main things that distinguishes Halliday's brand of linguistics from that of other linguists who are concerned chiefly with linguistic forms. Historically, the study of linguistics, he points out, first involved studying the way the language was put together, syntax and morphology, followed by the study of meaning. In his view, however, the reserve approach is more useful. As he puts it, a language is interpreted as a system of meanings, accompanied by forms through which the meanings can be expressed. So one way you can begin to make sense of the list of words above is to consider them as a series of choices. In other words, I wrote milk instead of juice and spaghetti instead of linguine. There must be some reason for this. You will still probably not be able to recognize this as a text because you do not have any understanding of what motivated these choices, why I wrote down these particular words, and the relationship between one set of choices. For example, milk versus juice, and another. It is these two pieces of missing information, the context of these choices, and the relationships between them, which form the basis for what we will be calling texture, that quality that makes a particular set of words or sentences a text, rather than a random collection of linguistic items. A language speaker's ability to discriminate between a random string of sentences and one forming a discourse, Halliday explains, is due to the inherent texture in the language and to his awareness of it. According to this formulation, there are two important things that make a text a text. One has to do with features inherent in the language itself. Things, for example, like grammatical rules, which help us to understand the relationship among the different words and sentences and other elements in the text. It is these features that help you to figure out the relationship between the various sets of choices, either lexical or grammatical, that you encounter. The problem with the text above is that it is not much in the language itself that helps you to do it. There are, however, two very basic things that help you to establish a connection among these words. The fact is that they appear in a list. They come one after another. This very fact helps to connect them together because you automatically think that they would not have been put together in the same list if they did not have something to do with one another. Another internal thing that holds these words together as a potential text is that they are similar. With the exception of light bulbs, they all belong to the same semantic field, words having to do with food. In fact, it is because of the words like milk and tomatoes that you are able to infer that what is meant by the word rocket is rocket lettuce or arugula, rather than the kind of rocket that shoots satellites into space. This semantic relationship among the words, however, is probably still not enough for you to make sense of this list as a text as long as you are relying only on features that are intrinsic to the language. The reason for this is that there are no grammatical elements that join these words together. It would be much easier for you to understand the relationship among these words if they appeared in a conversation like this. What do you need to get at the shop? Well, we need some milk and I want to make a salad, so let's get some tomatoes and rocket. And oh yeah, the light bulb in the living room is burnt out. We'd better get new ones. In this conversation, the relationships between the different words is much clearer because new words have been added. One important word that joins these words together is and, which creates an additive relationship among them, indicating that they are all part of cumulative list. Other important words are we, need. The word need connects the things in the list to some kind of action that is associated with them, and the word we connects them so we people who are also involved in this action. The second part of Holliday's formulation has to do with something that cannot be found in the language itself, but rather exists inside the minds of people who are perceiving the text, what Halliday calls an awareness of the conventions of the language, and, by extension, broader conventions of communication in a given society, which helps us to work out the relationships among words, sentences, paragraphs, pictures, and other textual elements, as well as relationships between these combinations of textual elements and certain social situations or communicative processes. These conventions give us a kind of framework within which we can fit the language. The framework for the text above, for example, is a shopping list. As soon as you have that framework, this list of words makes perfect sense as a text. In fact, you do not even need to refer back to the conversation above to understand what the text exactly means and how it will be used. All of the information about what people do with shopping list is already part of your common knowledge, the knowledge you share with other people in society. There is still one more thing that helps you to make sense of this as a text, and that has to do with the connections that exist between this particular collection of words and other texts that exist outside it. For example, this text might be related to the conversation above. In fact, it might be the result of that conversation. A might have written down list to B, dictated it to him or her. It might also be related to other texts, like a recipe for rocket salad that someone found in a cookery book. Finally, when A and B go to the supermarket, they will connect this text to still other texts, like signs advertising the price of tomatoes or the label on the milk carton telling them the expiry date. In other words, all texts are somehow related to other texts, and sometimes, in order to make sense of them or use them to perform social actions, you need to make reference to these other texts. To sum up, the main thing that makes a text is the relationships or connections. Sometimes these relationships are between words, sentences, or other elements inside the text. These kinds of relationships create what we refer to as cohesion. Another kind of relationship exists between the text and the person who is reading it or using it in some way. Here, meaning comes chiefly from the background knowledge of the person has about certain social conventions regarding texts, as well as the social situation in which the text is found and what the person wants to do with the text. This kind of relationship creates what we call coherence. Finally, there is the relationship between one text and the texts in the world that one might, at some point, need to refer to in the process of making sense of this text. This kind of relationship creates what we call intertextuality.